welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. But welcome all of you out there, all of you who are here to join us for this really excellent event, Africa in Perspective. We're going to look at gender empowerment in peace and security, and really re-examine the women, peace, and security agenda since the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 in 2000. What's changed, what's working, what isn't working, and what else do we need to do? It's an issue that many of us care deeply about and have been following very closely for a number of years. We're really excited today. We have an amazing lineup of expert panelists today, practitioners, we have policymakers, we have leaders, world leaders joining us, ministers and others. And so it's really a nice mix where we can try to learn as much from such a diverse audience as possible in order to promote the change that many of us believe in. And of course, for me, it's an enormous personal pleasure to welcome Her Excellency Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the former president of Liberia. I think most of you agree she's really been a truly inspiring leader, someone many of us have looked up to for years, and she really does continue to inspire and promote change on the global level. So I personally pleased to be able to welcome you today, Your Excellency. But of course, I'm going to hand the virtual microphone over to my colleague, Dr. Andrew Ya Chi, who is a senior research fellow at RUSI. He's also the Obasanjo Fellow at RUSI, and he really has helped increase significantly the work we've been able to do on Africa and Africa security issues. He will do a proper introduction of the former president, and he will also chair the first panel. I just wanted to make sure all of you know how much we care about this issue. We're really excited to have you here today, and we're really excited about the lineup that we have. So thank you again, and over to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Karen. As Karen has mentioned, my name is Dr. Andrew Chi, a Senior Research Fellow for Africa Security, and it's my pleasure to be hosting this event today. The Africa in Perspective program is designed to examine Africa's peace and security landscape across key thematic areas such as conflict, security, and peace operations. And today's Africa in Perspective webinar, as Karen has mentioned, will examine gender empowerment in peace and security. We're delighted, as Karen has mentioned, to have with us today Her Excellency, former President, Her Excellency Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who will deliver our keynote message. Her Excellency is a leading promoter of peace, justice, and democratic rule across Africa. During Charles Taylor's era, Her Excellency campaigned relentlessly for Charles Taylor's removal and played an active role in the transitional government of Liberia. In 2005, Her Excellency was elected as the president of Liberia and became the first woman to lead an African nation. In 2007, Her Excellency was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civil award in the US. This was done to acknowledge her personal courage and unwavering commitment to expanding freedom and improving the lives of people. In 2011, Her Excellency was jointly awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for her contributions to nonviolent struggle, for the safety of women, and for women's rights. In 2017, Her Excellency went on to then receive, or become the first recipient, of the Mo Ibrahim Prize for Achievement in African Leadership. And finally, more recently, Her Excellency was appointed co-chair of the independent panel for pandemic preparedness and response, which will evaluate the world's response to COVID-19. So without further waiting, I'll hand the floor over to Her Excellency Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the former President of the Republic of Liberia. Your Excellency.
Thank you, Andrew. Let me first recognize our esteemed African women leaders, Her Excellency President Sally Work-Sweda and President Joyce Banda, who may be speaking later today. My warm thanks to you, Dr. Von Hippel, for this invitation to join the many distinguished thought leaders and other interested participants during this month of commemoration and reflection on the progress made since United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 was passed. I have mixed emotions at this time. During this trying year, we have seen women assume leadership, whether they are leading countries or in other areas requiring leadership response. They saw the perils of inaction and of divisiveness, and they stepped forward, laying the ground for the critical global solidarity which has prevented more lives from being lost. This spotlights the need for collaboration and cooperation to address long-standing inequalities and injustices, to promote the research on a vaccine which should be shared with all, rich or poor. The COVID pandemic ripped the cover off any remnants of the fallacy that the world was rapidly becoming more equal. It tore at our consciences as we saw poverty deepen in many countries, as economies shrank, underemployment and unemployment increased, and as women already victims of intimate partner violence and in theaters of conflict could not leave or flee to seek safety. 2020 has brought us both many uplifting moments, such as when we saw the strength of civic action in both peace and conflict, often led by women, as in Sudan and Mali, as well as heartbreaking ones when we wondered whether the women victims of unconscionable levels of rape in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo, parts of South Sudan, huge areas of some of our sister Sahelian countries, and indeed, in my own country, felt any protection or empowerment from the resolution. I remained hopeful, however, as I am blessed to have lived beyond the biblically allocated 70, and therefore I can take the long view. So I do also celebrate Resolution 1325, as I see many countries engaged with its implementation, seeing the objectives not only as a foreign policy issue, and building alliances around the world, but also as a co-domestic one. I see recognition in the push for increased women's leadership in peacekeeping missions and in national defense forces, which are actively training women to move upwards. I also see hope in the number of national action plans, which are being reviewed and encouraged. However, the failings of Security Council 1325 reflect the larger struggle for women's rights and equality. Women are still making peace through informal processes and mechanisms. But the wisdoms of healing and knowledge gained is left out of national or regional peace negotiations, ensuring flawed negotiations focus only on power over, not power with, and short-lived agreements. Women face the same struggles in peace processes that they face in political processes. In too many countries, women lack access to land and credit, to equal pay, and higher level decision-making positions. This reflects the fundamental inequalities in our societies and a lack of agreement that women's participation in political life and leadership will accelerate development and peace. As you deliberate on these issues during this webinar, I hope you also bring enthusiasm and hope to the discussions. I hope that we will continue to see United Nations Security Resolution 1325 as a living document in which we all continue to participate and to ensure results. We owe it to those who cannot be here to speak with us today. We owe it to the women of the world. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, and thank you as well for your keynote message as well. Our first session will focus on the UN's role in incorporating gender within its peace and security agenda and highlighting the challenges and priorities specific to Sub-Saharan Africa. The session will examine how insecurity found in many parts of the continent is impacting the lives of women, Participants will explore how the interests of women can be promoted as a central component of ensuring peace across the continent. I'm delighted to have with us today 5 distinguished guest speakers who will explore these issues and many more. Our first speaker is Her Excellency Joseph Asako, who is the Commissioner for Rural Economy and Agriculture at the African Union Commission. Her Excellency previously served as a special advisor to 2 ministers in Angola, the Angola Minister of Environment, where she also served as the ambassador responsible for climate change, and as an advisor to the Minister of Agriculture, where she oversaw food security and poverty reduction. Her Excellency was also the former Secretary General of the Inter-African Coffee Organization for 13 years. Our second speaker is Her Excellency Dr. Fatima Daya, who currently serves as the Ambassador of Senegal to the United Kingdom. Her Excellency previously worked for the Senegalese government as the Social and Gender Lead Specialist and Manager from 2011 to 2014. Her Excellency later worked as the Commissioner for Social Affairs and Gender with ECOWAS from 2014 to 2018. Our third speaker is Her Excellency Sani Awudu, who is currently the Ambassador of Gabon to the United Kingdom. In 1995, after 2 years at the Foreign Affairs, as 2 years as the Foreign Affairs advisor to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Her Excellency was appointed head of the Department of Protocol Administration. In 2009, Her Excellency worked as the Deputy Secretary General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and was later posted as Ambassador to South Africa, Botswana, and Mozambique. Our fourth speaker is General Zakia Hussein, who serves as the Deputy Police Commissioner for the National Somali Police Force. General Hussein is the first woman in Somalia to be appointed General and Deputy Police Commissioner of the Somali Police Force. She has been a very, very vocal force for women's rights in Somalia as well. And our final speaker is Dr. Tony Halstrup, who is a senior research lecturer in the international politics at the University of Stirling. Her research focuses on global governance of security through the workings of regional security institutions like the African Union and the European Union. More recently, her research focuses on using critical feminist lens to understand the foreign policy practices of both institutions. So without further waiting, I'll open the floor to Her Excellency Joseph Asako, then to Her Excellency Dr. Fatima Daya, and then on to Her Excellency Sani Awudu, then on to General Zakia Hussein, and then on to Tony Halstrup, and then we'll open the session for Q&A. Your Excellency.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm certainly not Ambassador Sako. My name is Afekena Jerome. I'm a special advisor. Your Excellency Elif Jolif Salif, former president of Liberia, esteemed panelists, ladies and gentlemen. Ambassador Sako very much wanted to be with you this afternoon, but she has to be dragged to another program, the ongoing FAO Regional Congress. That's why she mandated me to quickly stand in for her, because she very much wanted to participate in this event. Invariably, I find that, like we heard from the keynote speaker, Resolution 1325, passed in October 2000, was one of the crowning achievements of the global women's movement, and perhaps and still one of the most inspired decisions of the United Nations Security Council. The adoption of this resolution was celebrated as a defining achievement for women's peace and security on a global scale. It provides an overarching, comprehensive, and wide-ranging policy framework for addressing the complexities and gaps surrounding women, conflict, peace, and security. While the resolution recognizes that women are disproportionately affected by violence during conflict, it also further underscored women's role in conflict prevention and ultimately calls for women's participation at all levels of peace processes, including peacekeeping, negotiations, and peace building. However, 2 decades have passed since this resolution was unanimously adopted, And the record of ground, like our keynote speaker told us, is that women are still not participating equally in peace and security initiatives. Regarding your question that we should relate this to agronomy, since we work in the field of agriculture, you find that looking at the African terrain, even before COVID came early this year, conflict accentuated by climate change has had a profound impact on food insecurity and livelihoods in Africa. In fact, reversing most of the gains that we have made in the past 5 years. As a result, you find that several African countries are not on track to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, especially SDG 2 by 2030. Statistically, 253 billion Africans, or 20% of the population, were suffering from chronic undernutrition in 2018. 239 million of them, unfortunately, in Sub-Saharan Africa. So the record is bleak. Unfortunately, for this even the particular sector, we don't have good statistics. We don't have enough data for us to be able to monitor what is happening. So invariably, while we find that women know that play prominent roles in African agriculture from farm to fork, they are disproportionately affected by conflict. Therefore, despite increasing levels of insecurity and violence against women and girls in conflict zones, whether you look at the Darfur, the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, the Sahel, and the northeastern Nigeria, women continue to be marginalized from formal peace processes, and they need to be involved in the conflict resolution process. While acknowledging, no doubt, that some progress have been made in the implementation of resolution over the last 30 years, there are gaps between the aspirations and the resolutions as demonstrated by the reality on ground. In particular, there are specific challenges with respect to protection and financing, which are lacking in the implementation of Resolution 1325. Therefore, to change the narrative, we'll just quickly provide some few recommendations. The first point we want everybody to live with here is that Africa needs lasting peace. It is for this reason that the African Union in 2020 chose the theme of the year to be silencing the guns so that we can have a durable peace. However, for peace to be lasting, it must, among other things, be inclusive. The time has come to understand that women are part of the solution. The second recommendation is that ultimately there is a need to stop perceiving Resolution 1325 merely as a normative framework, but to conceive it as an instrument that has to be translated into actions with support from government, civil society, grassroots women, donors, and the international community. The third point we are going to make is that governments all over the world, including Africa, can assist in moving the resolution forward through enabling policies, the provision of education, and raising awareness of the resolution, as well as implementation of national action plans. Finally, I think to all of us interested in moving this resolution forward, there is need for us to engage in capacity building and training, as well as identifying competent women in the field of peace and security who will form a critical mass that can drive the agenda of UN Resolution 1325 forward. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you very much. And I'll head over to Her Excellency, Dr. Fatimata Dia, Your Excellency.
Thank you, Andre. I would like, first of all, to, it's today a great pleasure for me to participate in this panel Africa perspective, gender empowerment in peace and security. And I would like to thank the Royal United Service Institute for Defense and Security Studies. And also my warm regards to Her Excellency Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the former president of Liberia, and all the women leaders in this important audience. Thank you for your presence. Since 2008, what I can say is we have put in place updated policies and plan of action that we have undertaken in the Western Africa, specifically ECOWAS region, that have 13 countries among the most poor in the world. On gender perspective, specifically as a commissioner, I was at the front between 2014 and 2018 under the leadership of ECOWAS, head of state. And we have worked hardly in women empowerment. The West African region has put in place in 2015, very recently, the Additional Act for Equality between Men and Women for a Sustainable Development that should enhance women empowerment for a sustainable development to reinforce the gender peace and security challenges within the ECOWAS conflict prevention framework, which is also another challenge, women, peace and security component, as an important step forward in ECOWAS, as is not only address issues of preventing the violation of human rights and the protection of the right in time of conflict and related issues, but also highlights the need for women's participation in peace and security development to reinforce the gender peace and security challenges within the ECOWAS conflict. Beyond advocacy and sensitization of men, a women development approach is useful today in highlighting how the analysis of gender issues challenge the concept of gender. For a very long time, studies and research have been focused on the specificity of women in relation to the neutral masculine in terms of complementarity, implicit hierarchy of the men. Now the new gender approach in Africa wants to do beyond that consideration. It assumes that the reflection and study of social, economic, and demographic study situation focus not only on the characteristic of individual, possibly aggregated, but on the relationship between the two female and men component of humanity, and on a better understanding of this relationship and their impact on those situations. Today, we have new gender issues that should be taken into account in the 3025 United Nations resolution, as well as in all our plan of action related to gender, peace, and security. We have the cybercriminality, we have money laundering, we have the terrorism in West Africa and everywhere in Africa, terrorism in jihadism as active, where women are playing an active role as participants. We have the clandestine immigration of women and children. That is an issue at the level of Africa. We have violence, abuse in refugee camps. That is very sad for women specifically and for girls and boys. And those considerations need to rethink the gender perspective. To speak of the gender dimension in the current context of Africa would lead us as leaders to consider both the regional, the ecologic space affected by drought and desertification, and also the geopolitical space of nearly 54 member states divided into 5 regional economic communities. In this context, the state of human security are enormous for these countries. They are political, they are economic and ecological, and challenge both demographic governance, human rights, health issues in this context of pandemic, and the full citizen of men and women. Hence, the urgency and importance of creating the condition of inter-regional cooperation to act on security, peace, is challenging us, and to reverse gender inequalities through new laws, new advocacy, human approach, training, woman empowerment, and gender approach in early warning, specifically for prevention, participation, and peace. And I think that similarly, the cross-border nature of crime and its connection to terrorism require coordinated initiative with the gender dimension to better understand the problem, because it's not very, very clear to us now how to grow through all these challenges. According to the report of the high-level conference on women, violence, and terrorism in West Africa and the Sahel, building a regional and international response organized recently by the United Nations Office for West Africa and the Sahel, UNOWAS, in collaboration with the ECOWAS region, the G5 Sahel, the Mano River Union, the Women, Youth, Peace and Security Working Group in West Africa, and the Sahel and the United Nations system in West Africa and other Al-Qaeda's group have now placed the subjugation of women and girls at the front of their strategy. So we have new challenges that go beyond the United Nations Resolution 3025. And I think that we have to make in place a very inclusive program that relate to advocacy, not only sensitization, but advocacy, changing the laws of our countries, and also making men at the heart of every change related to gender, peace, and security. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. And I'll head now to Her Excellency Sani. Your Excellency Sani Awudu, can you hear us okay?
Yes.
Yes, you're now live.
Your Excellencies.
Sorry, Your Excellency, you're now muted, so you might need to unmute yourself. Brilliant, thank you.
Thank you. Your Excellencies, dear panelists, good afternoon to everyone. It is a great honor and privilege to say a few words on this panel discussion based in Africa in Perspective, Gender Empowerment in Peace and Security. As you know, women represent the largest segment of the population in various African countries in the world. Despite the fragile status of women in Africa, which considered often as a land of human rights violation and inequalities, women play a leading role. Surely, the Sub-Saharan region and the African continent faces many challenges which impact and destabilize women. Nowadays, the development of nations cannot take place without the effective inclusion of women, especially in conflict prevention and management, decision-making processes, peace and security. The United Nations Resolution 1325 was the first to assert that women matter for peace. In this resolution, the Security Council clearly recognizes the essential role that women play in advancing peace, development, and human rights. But what about the effective application on these principles and recommendations in sub-Saharan countries? It should be mentioned here that each country has its own realities. However, women play a fundamental role in the regulation and balance in African society. From the African traditional perspective and culture, a woman symbolizes and promotes peace. She unites and soothes. Women have always been involved in the search of solutions to several conflicts affecting our societies. On that point, allow me to say a few words about my country, the country I know better than any other. I was born in Gabon. It is a country in Central Africa. This country is considered a haven of peace. We have never experienced war. Nonetheless, we quickly understood the deeply rooted role of women within our society. In Gabon, women have a driving role in the development of the country in its key aspect of life. In mediation, in our traditional societies, in education, and at the governmental level. So our culture is well grounded in the spirit and goals of Resolution 1325 to protect women. In this spirit that the President of the Republic launched what we call the Decade of Gabonese Women for 2015 to 2025 to give women their rightful place in Gabon's development. One of the priorities implemented since February 2010 is the program called the National Strategy for Equity and Gender Equality, which is a project to involve all women without any discrimination in the decision-making process at all levels. Indeed, several women hold senior positions of responsibility in both public and private administration in Gabon. I can say here that it's the case with the Constitutional Court, the Senate, and the and at the Prime Minister level. Three key institutions all shared by women of high competences. Moreover, allow me here with humility, I would like to point out that I am myself a concrete example of this policy, being a woman, diplomat, and appointed in London, which is one of the highest posting abroad. Overall, progress has been made in the development of policies, strategy, action plans for the implementation of the women, peace and security agenda on the African continent. While these results are encouraging, a tremendous amount of work remains. Women deserve to be supported and further promoted in the education, employment, and their effective inclusion at all levels. So awareness must be multidimensional to fight against violence, hatred by promoting the culture of peace, good governance, tolerance, forgiveness, dialogue, mutual respect, and above all, diversity in our countries. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. And now we'll go over to General Zakia Hussein, who will open with her remarks. General, you're muted still, sorry. Apologies.
Excuse me, sorry for that. Your Excellencies, Dr. Andrew, everybody who's present here, excellent ladies, I'm very pleased to be in your presence today and participating in this webinar on women empowerment. Talking from my own experience in Somalia, perhaps when you hear the word Somalia, what comes to mind is civil war, terrorism, rape, and other such crimes. However, let me tell you that that is one narrative, and there's another narrative that may not have been promoted as fully as that narrative, and I would like to share that narrative with you today. There is one particular concept that I feel is slowly becoming a cliche, which is if you want to combat or prevent gender-based violence or reconstruct the meaning of gender in African context, we need to promote more women in leadership. That concept in the Somali context has actually worked very well. In terms of the security sector, I may be the first female to reach the Brigadier General rank, and as a Deputy Police Commissioner, the Somali women's involvement in the security sector dates back to as early as our independence in 1960. Somalia was actually the first African country to produce our first female pilot in the entire continent in 1976. And since then, Somali women have taken up very high positions and played a key role in peace and security in Somalia. We unfortunately had a very violent civil war in the 90s, closely followed after that, we had the terrorism problem. But since 2006, there's been a very much development in the security sector and specifically on women empowerment. Since I have been involved in the security sector, whether it is from intelligence agency, within the criminal justice and the police, we've seen and we have currently a lot of women serving in very high positions. This has actually helped us to combat gender-based violence in our country, prevented or prosecuted successfully rape perpetrators, and prevented other gender-based violence related concepts. For the last 4 years or so, under the leadership of the current president, Mohamed Abdullahi Farmajo, women have been extremely promoted of all sectors of the government. We now have a cabinet where over 10% of our cabinet is female. We have a first female deputy police commissioner. We have a police force of which 12% of our force is women, which is one of the highest in Africa. I think South Africa, Ghana, and Liberia only a higher number. We also have had director generals that have been serving within the Ministry of Defense and high positions within the intelligence services as well. All of these activities and promotions of women empowerment has actually helped Somalia to recover itself from the violent civil war and recovering itself from a period of terrorism related activities within our country. So this concept of promoting women to leadership positions in key leadership positions have worked very well in the Somali context. When it comes to constructing gender in the African context, I would also like to say that there is a lot of narrative constructions that we need to be focusing on. I think it was the founder of the critical theory of international relations, Dr. Kenneth Booth, who famously said that every knowledge is for some purpose and for some person, which means in the African context, when we are talking about a gender construct, we have to understand from which point of view this narrative is coming. And I think this is where us as government officials within Africa are kind of failing to produce good narratives and produce the successes, produce data, produce facts that can actually support and showcase that Africa is taking high steps towards not only empowering its women, but also leaving behind its dark passes and moving forward in their development. Speaking of narrative, I think it's also very important that we take our time to consider that women are not only victims of violence and terrorism, they can also be perpetrators of such violence or facilitators of such violence. In particularly in the Somali context, for instance, female suicide bombers have been known to be utilized by the Al-Shabaab terrorism groups. So far, we've had 4 over a space of, I think, about 12 years. And unfortunately, they have proven to be the most lethal. So the narrative of gender construct in Africa must also include, in my view, the role of women as violent perpetrators or facilitators as such. In the context of COVID-19, Somalia, thanks to God, we have been quite lucky in the sense that we have not seen the brunt of the COVID-19 as other countries have. It was with us for a few months and it moved on. So it's very difficult for us to analyze the impact that it has had on women empowerment or women development in Somalia as such. In conclusion, what I would like to say that is Africa has come a long way when it comes to promoting women in peace and security. The high profiles that are part of this panel today is actually a testament to that fact, but we still have a lot to work left. As I said, I caution against viewing women in leadership as a cliche, when in fact it is a concept that has worked brilliantly, at least in our context. We also need to start providing a more holistic narrative of women in peace and security, look at them both as perpetrators as well as victims and how that can be constructed. And although Africa has seen a negative impact of the COVID-19, particularly economically, as the world transport system has almost come to a standstill, I'm also very confident in the resilient nature of our African people to overcome whatever challenges that COVID-19 has produced. But the other pandemic that we need to focus on academically is this gender construct that we have negatively being produced about African women. so many of us are part of this panel today. It's a testament against that negative gender construct of Africa, and we need to do a bit more work to promote that holistic narrative. I thank you all for your kind attention, and I look forward to a very lively discussion with you all.
Thank you very much. And I will go now to Dr. Tony Harshwood.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Chi, for inviting me, and to my fellow panelists, to Your Excellencies, and General Hussein, thanks very much for setting the scene, really. It's very difficult to follow such excellent interventions. But I perhaps wanted to focus on some of the prompts that Dr. Chi previously sent, which is around women's empowerment in the context of course, the 20th anniversary, but also the impact of COVID. And I wanted to focus on two things in particular. One is the enduring impact of patriarchy on the one hand, but also secondly, thinking about how we can better think about whether it's the normative framework or existing instruments to use in Africa. So the first around patriarchy, I wanted to emphasize that while it is absolutely right that we do focus on Africa today, the entire planet faces that same challenge of patriarchy that manifests in different ways. And so I take as very important General Hussein's point about gender constructs, that yes, we might face particular challenges, particularly linked to certain violent forms of insecurity in Africa. Nevertheless, this is a global challenge, the challenge of patriarchy, the idea that, you know, the experiences of men, the experiences of certain masculinities should be the norm in the formation of the international system. And so when I think about Africa, whether sub-Saharan or above the Sahara, I sort of try to co-locate Africa in the world, right? So what is Africa's relationship with the world, and how are those patriarchal power structures reproduced with impacts on women's lives and livelihoods? And one of the things that we've seen, particularly when we then bring in a crisis like COVID, and I think, you know, we've already heard the different ways in which COVID has manifested itself, particularly with respect to different types of gendered violence, domestic violence, and sexual violence, is that whereas, of course, there has been a push to prevent COVID from spreading as much as possible, we also know that a lot of the practices around this are those that reflect very much the masculinized experiences of the majority of the leadership in Africa. And of course, in so doing, then has a negative impact on the lives and livelihoods of women on the continent. So in the first instance, in response to Dr. Chi's prompt, you know, what do we do about you know, women's empowerment? Is first, we must acknowledge the impact of patriarchy in shaping the different forms and systems of power and the interactions in between genders. But also, I also wanted to highlight, as evidenced by the entirety of this panel, from the keynote to the panel speakers. I don't think the issue is about empowering going over to empower women. I mean, in the words of the song, women are already doing it for themselves. And this panel is already evidence enough of it. The entire session is evidence enough of it. So I think, you know, the key issue is creating the space for women, both women in top positions of power, but also women in their community spaces, to help articulate the practices that they already bring to peace building, to conflict resolution, and to peacemaking more broadly. And I sort of see a sense of optimism to do this in some of the initiatives that have come out of the African Union, whether it's through FemWise, that doesn't assume that, you know, you need to go teach women in Africa about mediation, but rather trying to bring the knowledges of different types of women into the fore as being intrinsic, and their experiences as being there to have an impact on the world around them. So we can think of FemWise, but we can also think about the African Women's Leadership Network and the different national chapters. I mean, if you look at the context of those networks alone, we don't need to go out there to look for different leaders. They are there, they are doing the work that will be considered leadership. So of course, the question is, why don't we hear more about them? Why don't we see the work that it is that they're doing? And for me, the answer sort of relies on patriarchy. Patriarchy is committed to maintaining the status quo. And that's the one thing we cannot forget. And so for me, the challenge of the last 20 years, and something I think that would be essential for us to work on moving on from the Women, Peace and Security agenda, is that it's not enough to keep speaking about gender equality. Almost every country now, every member of the United Nations understands that we have to do something related to UNSCR 1325. In fact, it's become a thing of status to sort of have some sort of policy or acknowledgement of 1325. So every country, every member state has an idea of, women, peace and security agenda. We need to sort of move beyond simply talking about the resolution. And indeed, I would argue, actually, simply having an action plan in of itself is not enough. There needs to be a renewed commitment to using all those frameworks that exist and actually using them while drawing on the experiences of the women in different parts of society that are already doing the work. In Africa, we don't just have the Women, Peace and Security agenda. We have one of the most progressive instruments, the Maputo Protocol, and yet it has not been ratified by every member state of the African Union. It is there as a framework, and it is one that is leveraged by a lot of women's movements on the continent. And now we have to, campaign and sort of link the implementation of the Maputo Protocol, the Women, Peace and Security agenda, as being essential to the transformation of societies and indeed achieving a feminist peace. And this is where I want to end. I think that in order for us to sort of move forward and thinking through the roles of women, because again, as I said, I think that women are already doing it. We need to not simply be wanting gender equality, because it is possible to bring women into systems and simply maintain those systems as they are. We want transformation. We want gender equity as a condition of that transformation. And from everything I've heard this morning, this has simply been reinforced. And that transformation has an end. For me, that end is a feminist peace where everybody in society, men, women, girls and boys, other marginalized genders, can live their lives at their fullest. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I want to open up the discussion and really, thank you all for your remarks and for your comments on this. But I guess the question is, many would argue, again and again, we see a lot of agreements and things that are put in place, as Dr. Harship has mentioned. But how do we achieve these things from a solid perspective? How do we encourage the African Union not to just empower the existing system by, as you said, Tony, and to quote you, not to quote you, but how do we to move just to be on putting women in certain positions, but to reforming the whole entire institutions that govern and that control many of this? But also, I think the other question really for all of the panelists is about, Tony talks about this idea of feminist peace. But moving beyond that also is, how do we really empower some of, also I would say, the younger generation, the youth, women and young men, to be able to support that agenda? Because I sense a frustration oftentimes when people talk about this, that, we want to move it forward. We see the recommendations, 30% in, which is all oftentimes ratified and enshrined in law, but actually is never actually achieved. So how do we just move beyond it just being policy to actually being something that is solid, that we can move the whole entire continent forward? And I'll throw that question to Professor Jeremy, who is in replacement for Her Excellency Joseph Asako.
Sorry, I was muted. I guess I'm fine. Okay.
Yes, we can hear you, Professor.
Very rich, rigorous discussion so far. And I have some few takeaways in as much as I want to try and answer your question. The first point I want to make is that it is not all despair. I think we are making progress. I mean, just today, I mean, an African was named as the WTO Director General. I mean, that is very good for Africa. I mean, congratulations to her. Coming specifically to the issues, I mean, I do think the first point I want to make is that the narrative has to change because currently women constitute the bulk of the African population. When I look at the statistics, the recent statistics, women comprises 51% of Africa's population. So they have to determine and be part of the narrative, what is happening. So as a man, I mean, in as much as many of us are convinced about what is happening, I'm here by default, for example. It would be nice to involve men in some of these discussions. If you want to solve the issue of patriarchy and what have you, I'm here by default. Otherwise, there would have been no man on this panel. So maybe these are some things you should try and moving forward. Specifically, in terms of the question you ask pertaining to young men and women, I want to think that we need a holistic approach. Building on what has worked so far, we need a holistic, and we need to start incorporating these things, involving more men in the discussion. The part that is especially challenging to me is how to protect women against abuse and violence during conflict. In as much as we also need to build their agencies, because women play very many different roles during conflict. I think I want to stop here so far. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go to Her Excellency. Let me go over Her Excellency Sani. Do you want to jump in, and then I'll go to Her Excellency Dr. Fatima. And then I'll come to you, Tony. Your Excellency, you're muted.
Is it fine?
Yes, we have you now.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Andrew. About changing the narrative, I agree that we have to involve more men in this issue. But I think from the African perspective, I think the education is a key problem. We have to send more and more our girls, our daughters at school, because our daughter and our girls, they have to be well trained. They have to know their right at the beginning. And yes, education is a key issue. And after that, I think we can have more equality in the society, more equity in the society. But I think we have to start by sending our daughters and our girls at the school. This is my point of view.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. And Your Excellency, Dr. Fatimata, do you want to jump in? You're muted at the moment. Sorry, Excellency.
Thank you, Andre. About changing actually the ongoing challenges we have in terms of approach. I am thinking that it's right that we have good convention, very strong convention and policies that has been adopted by our head of state, the United Nations agencies, the civil society, and everybody have tried to put in place very big convention and plan of actions that are actually ongoing. But I think that beyond that, we have to go also through laws. We have to change our laws in terms of action to be done at the court. For example, when I related to the violence and the abuse that has been actually facing women and girls. That is a process of human development, and we have to make it at the heart of our intervention in terms of peace and security. I'm thinking also about, like my brother said, putting the men at the heart of the intervention. Whatever intervention in terms of advocacy, in terms of respecting the laws, in terms of sensitization, how the men can be trained, like I'm thinking, for example, to the military at the area of conflict and post-conflict, how we can train them to make them aware of the laws, and so we can better enhance the gender peace and security in the area of conflict and post-conflict. I'm thinking also of the necessary training that is actually, it has been said, we have to train men and women together, we have to advocate them. And it's very important, because when we want to respect the United Nations 3025 with respect to prevention, protection, participation, the training and advocacy is very important. I think that the African Union is doing a very good job. ECOWAS also, all the West African, the regional communities are doing their best in terms of advocacy and training, but it's not enough. We have to do beyond, because education, like my sister said, is also a key point, but not all the people are actually educated. So we have to make a good point on advocacy, training for those who are not educated, and emphasize for our little girls and boys its education, the level of education for all forms of discrimination, for men and for women. I'm also thinking to involve the young leadership women. At the level of ECOWAS, we have what we call the leadership for change for young female, which have been implemented in terms of network. And actually they are very active at the parliament level. They can make advocacy in the parliament, they can make advocacy in the civil society level, and maybe put change for gender issues in terms of peace and security. It's the same for the networks that have been implemented at the level of West Africa, is the network for women, peace and security in West Africa. That is very active actually. And they are doing a very good job in terms of advocacy, in terms of making aware both men and women the necessary change to be done to enhance peace and security, and also women empowerment in all levels. I would like to emphasize one point that Dr. Tony has said about empowerment. We don't need to talk about empowerment because our women are already empowered. That's right. But I think that empowerment is continued. If we can make a change at a high level, for example, having women ambassador, women prime minister, women ministers, or whatever, is necessary to change also the basic level. Because in the rural area, in where the economy is very important for our women, where they participate around 70% of their labor in rural labor, the women are not progressing. So, and in this context, the empowerment of women is very important. To make them aware, make them train, make them have access to resources, access to credit, access to capital and training is also very important, and it should be continued, because these women in this context of rural area, they are not trained and they need resources to make change. If you don't have power, you don't have access to land, not access to capital, not access to resources, you cannot go to a high level. You cannot even make the difference in terms of human development and economic development. And I think that the two levels should be well differentiated, and intervention also should be differentiated according to the level. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. I'll go to Tony, and then I'll go to General Zakia.
Right, thanks very much. Those are really good questions. I mean, I think one of the things I wanted to highlight was Absolutely. I think the point about feminist peace, and I think I said this very briefly towards the end of my initial intervention, is if we're simply including women into the frameworks that were established with certain masculinized ideas, then we can't actually expect things to change just because we've included women. What we need are people of all genders who are committed, again, to this idea of transformation. So certainly you definitely need men on board. But at the same time, I think that, you know, we are still in a space where the full experiences of women have not really been engaged. And I think the point that Her Excellency Dia made at the end is very true. That oftentimes, at least in the context of my work, when we think about women, we think about women in urban centers. We don't really think about, you know, what are the experiences of rural women? And to what extent are the experiences of rural women actually informing the policies that we're designing and the policy processes? Because oftentimes we still expect the rural women to sort of fit into the model that was created by, you know, even by allies in the urban centers. So in an, you know, in the ideal space, what we would want is a consideration of these different categories, these different roles. And I certainly agree that these different roles and these different categories need to be resourced, right? We can't just say, oh, hey, you know, rural women, you can come to this talk that we're giving about, I don't know, agricultural practices in the country, but we're not actually resourcing them when they're the ones who sort of, you know, effectively feeding the nation and they've been doing the work. So we have to think about, you know, what are the mechanisms through which, given that we're still very much within a state system, but also our regional organizations, what are the mechanisms through which they can devise to reach and engage? So I don't see it as just a one-way street of, you know, we're doing something for the rural women or we're doing something for the marginalized women. But how do we engage with these different constituencies? And it's not just women, it's also men. How do we engage with these different constituencies so that we can gain from their experiences to inform a vision that is national, regional, and indeed overall global? And I think that this is really important. But going back to one of the earlier points, how do we get to this? First and foremost, I think we need to do more in terms of those of us who advocate for this, in terms of researchers, in thinking through how we can better integrate the regional and the global normative frameworks within national legal contexts. Because when we have this, and we know that, you know, I agree that it's not actually all been negative, that people are, you know, out there doing their thing and are becoming more vocal about accessing their rights. But of course, we know that, you know, they're sometimes twatted at every corner. But I think that one, you know, concrete way in which we can think about doing this is actually bringing those frameworks into national law so that women and girls can leverage their national law. As somebody who's very invested in regionalism, I do not know that somebody in a, you know, in a town out in the outskirts of Ibadan in Nigeria has any understanding of the Maputo Protocol. But if we can sort of think about how we bring those within our national laws, then we are closer to women, ordinary women, being able to actually leverage and access their rights that they can demand as citizens of particular countries.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And General Zakia, I'm going to give you 1 minute, unfortunately. We're running out of time, so if you can keep it short and to the point, and then I'll take one last question and then we'll wrap up.
Absolutely. Thank you, Doctor. I'll just pick up on what Dr. Tony actually said. It's very important that we actually understand the context and the language that we're talking in. If we want to be talking about encouraging younger generation to take up leadership positions, younger females to take up leadership positions, we need to be able to speak in the language that this particular generation understands, which means it will be different from my generation, who was raised by the women who struggled for independence, who struggled for empowerment, to enable us to be where we are today. I mean, when I was young, my mom used to tell me, you have to do because you are a woman, not you cannot do because you are a woman. So this new generation, we need to understand their language and speak to them in that particular language. We also need to understand the context in which we are working. The experience in Senegal, the experience in Gabon would not be equal to experience in Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa, or Somalia for that matter. So we need to actually, as Africans, first and foremost, take ownership of the UN resolution, make it African-centric, and then make it relevant to our particular country context. And in terms of encouraging females to take up more, participating in the security sector is very important. We actually promote and let people understand the different roles that women can play. Being a security officer does not necessarily mean that you have to carry a gun and be on the street and risking your life for that matter. There's so many different roles within the security sector that women can take up, and that needs to be promoted. And lastly, I would say, in every sector, in every society, in every country, there has to be champions for this particular cause for it to be put forward. And they need to be able to, like I said, speak in the language that people understand and in the context that they operate in. I hope that was short enough.
Thank you very much, General. And I'm going to take one last question. I'm going to start in the reverse order. So Tony, please get ready. And please try and keep your remarks to 1 minute if possible, because time is not on our side. So the question is coming in, that's coming, it says, how do we get to a genuine attitude or change on gender equity in the security space? And how do we engage women who have not been involved in this or who might not have an interest in this area? I know, General Zaki, you talked about the Somali example, but particularly in other spaces where, in other countries, sorry, where particularly in the security space, there is let's say not all women might want to join or be part of that. How do we encourage that? But also, how do we get to it, as a person has written the question, gender equity in the security space? And I'll go in reverse order. So Dr. Tony Harshrup.
Right, thanks very much. And I'll try to be very brief. I mean, fundamentally, I have seen absolutely no evidence to suggest that women are somehow shy away from the security sector. They might shy away from certain positions, like the ones that are most visible, but security is a concern of both men and women, and indeed everybody in society. So there is an investment there. In terms of, how thinking through, how is it then that we can get the sort of changes that we want and getting sort of marginalized genders within the security space. I mean, I think the first concern, and again, bringing in the men, is that we, in our certain positions of privilege, we need to do as much as possible to create the space for the voices that we don't usually hear. And we need to, do our utmost and our best to tell our friends and our colleagues to create the space for people who are not otherwise heard. So it's those in power and those who already hold leadership positions that have to create that space. But I absolutely fundamentally believe that every woman that I've met, the ones that I engage with in my research, is invested in security, but we might need to think about the different ways in which they are engaged.
Brilliant, thank you so much. And over to you, General Zakia.
Thank you, Dr. Again, I go back to the context and why people are not interested. It's important to understand that. I mean, the women of Somalia, why are they not interested to join, will be different from the answers that will be provided by the women in, for instance, Nigeria, and why they don't want to be joined in. Once you understand the reasons that's preventing women from joining, then you can actually try to find the remedies for these preventions. In particularly from my experience within the Somali context, I mean, I have 12% of my force are all female, but one of the biggest challenges that we have to more female joining the forces, but also promoting and getting higher ranks, is an economic issue, because we know most of our families in Africa, whether it's Somalia, Nigeria, or Gabon, or Senegal, are matriarchal, which means the economy is upon the responsibility of the mother. And as a mother and as a police officer, it will be difficult for you to kind of juggle both of those two duties. And when you are a mother, you will choose your children first. So if that is an issue, for instance, then it is important that the government understands that and then try to promote women and provide economical incentives which will allow for these girls to be breadwinners, to be mothers, and to be police officers or military or whatever part of the security sector it is. So like I said, it's important to understand the actual barriers that are specific to your particular context and then trying to combat it accordingly.
Brilliant. Thank you. It's sharp as always, General. And we'll go now over to Her Excellency, sorry, Ambassador Sani. You're muted, Your Excellency.
Sorry. I think everything has been said, but I would like just to say that the security issue, as Dr. Tony said, is not only for women, is about women and men. And when the peace is, we don't have peace in our country, is about women and men lives. And as women leaders or women who are already getting some posting, we have to try to encourage the women who are in the rural area, or the young women, our daughters, our girls, to try to sensibilize and to try to mentor them and giving them tools to understand what is going on. And we need to create this bridge between the old generation as us and the new generation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I will now head to Her Excellency Dr. Fatimata Dia, and then.
Thank you, Andre. I will say that we have tried to make maybe to look at the challenges that we have today in terms of women, peace and security, maybe gender empowerment, the United Nations 3025. But my last word will be the new challenge that we are facing. I talk about it at the beginning of my words, talking about cyber criminality, about migration. I talk about traffic of young people, of boys, of girls, of women, even in other countries out of Africa. Those are very, very strong challenges that actually we are facing in terms of women, peace and security. And the decision making is very important. We have also talked about high level of having women at the big decision making, but often it's not changing the condition of women at medium level and the basic level. We should look at how to make change at any time to make difference in terms of approach when we are talking about gender, peace and security. And maybe my last word will be that in all level, the economics and the politics are very important. We have to look at gender decision making in politics, gender decision making in economics. We have to look at the court of justice, who are there, are there women, who are there men? Are we able to change anything at the level of the court? So those are questions that we have to ask ourselves to see whether we can make change. Because often education is very good, but actually the situation, the context is that we don't have that women we need everywhere we are. So to make change. So inclusion of men is very important. We have said that, because they are all levels of decision making. Men are at the court, they are at the policies, they are at the high level of economics. So we cannot work without the men. And this is my last word. We have to make challenges on issues that we have actually at the level of Africa: migration, cyber criminality, all these women in conflict where women are making bombs, for example, in Nigeria, how to make change of those things that we are challenging us. This is very important. So this is new questions that we have to question ourselves to make difference. This is my last word. I would like to thank all the panels here, and we're looking forward to have your wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. And I'll head over to Professor Jerome, and he will have the last 1 minute word.
Thank you, moderator. In terms of a genuine change in the security space, I'm going to be a little bit controversial here. I don't necessarily think it's a good thing, because we have too many senseless and violent conflicts in Africa, and we don't want our women to get killed. I would suggest instead that everybody should embrace the African Union silencing the guns, and where women can play a more purposeful role. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. And unfortunately, that brings us to the end of this session. I would like to thank Professor Jeremy for standing in for Her Excellency Joseph Asako, Her Excellency Dr. Fatimata Adea, Her Excellency Sani Awadu, General Zakia Hussein, and Dr. Tony Houstrip for their contributions, but also for their really insightful discussion. And we could have gone on and on and on, but we have to start the next session. So up next, we have our next session is called Gendered Responses to Security in Africa, which will be chaired by my colleague, Mark Williams. Over to you, Mark.
Good afternoon, and indeed good morning and good evening to all of our participants and panelists joining us from different regions around the world. My name is Mark Williams, and I'm a research analyst with the Royal United Services Institute, who has the privilege of hosting the second session of this interactive panel. As was discussed in the first hour and a half, we've hoped humbly to reaffirm some of the concrete principles underlying Resolution 1325 and the vitally important role of women in the prevention and resolution of conflict. For this second part of the session, we are proud and grateful for the attendance of 4 distinguished guests, the first of whom is Mr. Luis Carrillo, United Nations Police Advisor since 2017, who's directly accountable to the Assistant Secretary General for Rule of Law and Security Institutions. At present, the United Nations Police brings together over 11,000 officers from over 90 countries. And Mr. Luis's position builds on a distinguished career as Chief Superintendent with the Public Security Service Police in Portugal, as well as separate roles as the United Nations Police Commissioner in various peacekeeping operations, notably stabilization missions in the Central African Republic, Haiti, and East Timor, amongst others. Mr. Carrillo will then be followed by Her Excellency Anita Kokuru-Ngwero, Deputy Joint Special Representative of the African Union and the United Nations Joint Mission in Darfur, appointed in 2018. Ms. Ngwero has served as Resident Coordinator or Resident Representative for the United Nations Development Programme in Namibia, as well as Chief of Section for Africa and Head of Office for Somalia with the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Our third speaker will be Dr. Solange Bandiaki-Badji, Senior Director of Sub-Saharan Africa and Women, Peace and Security for Partners Global, an organization that works through a global network to create partnerships with local change leaders, to transform conflict, strengthen democratic institutions, and achieve sustainable development. Dr. Bandiaki-Badji's strategic understanding of trends, issues, and options around gender in Africa will be invaluable to this conversation. We will finally hear from Dr. Yolanda Bucha, Assistant Professor in the Department of Political Studies at Queen's University. Her research and specific teaching focus is on gender, African politics, and security, as well as political violence and ethics in conflict-affected societies. Among her large portfolio of writings, she has notably produced 2 flagship pieces on transitional justice in post-genocide Rwanda, as well as the role of female combatants in Southern Africa. As was the case in the first half of this session, please feel free to use the Q&A function in the chat box, which will inform the discussion we will have afterwards. Without any further delay, I'd like to hand over to Mr. Luis Carrillo, United Nations Police Advisor. I think you're muted, Mr. Carrillo. Technologies.
Well, good morning and thank you very much, Mark, and Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, my dear colleagues, distinguished panelists. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. And of course, it's a pleasure for me to join all of you today and to share our respective efforts to ensure that gender considerations remain firmly at the center of our work. Of course, when we celebrate 20 years of the Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, I'm very honored to be here today to represent the United Nations Police. As Mark said, we have and we represent more than 11,000 police officers from more than 90 countries, women and men serving in 14 missions across the globe. Of these peace operations, 8 are in Africa, while of course the member states from Africa are also providing more than half of our police officers. The United Nations Police is the police of the 193 member states, varying from, of course, in the peace operations, Mali, South Sudan, Darfur, Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of Congo, and of course, several others across the globe. The United Nations Police is usually one of the most visible faces of the United Nations, and we are also one of the most visible representatives of the UN in the countries where we deploy. And women police officers play a key role. Women and men alike, we assist host state authorities to maintain law and order, protect civilians, and maintain peace and engage with the local populations, including the civil society, with human rights mainstreamed throughout. First and foremost, it is important to note that every one police officer is a human rights officer. Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has forced us, all of us, women and men alike, police officers and other first responders, to reprioritize our activities, particularly in some areas. In addition to our core mandated tasks of operational support and capacity building, we assist with humanitarian and awareness raising efforts in support of national counterparts and communities where women police officers have been and are making and playing a key role. Women, children, and other vulnerable populations in particular have been amongst the hardest hit by this pandemic, which has highlighted the importance of integrated gender perspectives in all our work. Central to this is the Strategic Guidance Framework for International Policing, or SGF, which we developed with our 193 member states, regional intergovernmental bodies, UN entities, police training centers, and the academy, including, of course, and particularly from Africa. The Strategic Guidance Framework articulates our internationally agreed approach for policing, our framework, which, amongst other things, dictates ensuring gender responsiveness in our support to police and other law enforcement agencies in member states. To this end, we maintain a robust network of gender focal points who spearhead the development of mission-specific gender action plans and implementation of the Women, Peace and Security WPS agenda. Across the United Nations Police components, women shine the light of the unique needs and concerns that must be taken into consideration. For instance, women's participation in UN police operations, especially in mission areas characterized by strong cultural barriers in terms of women interact with men, illustrates clearly that policing is at the best when it reflects fully the community it serves and when all policing functions are undertaken equally by women and men. I am especially pleased to report today that senior women officers had 3 United Nations police components in IBA, UNISFA, Cyprus, UNFICIP, and in South Sudan, UNMISS, originally coming also from different continents, including Africa. With regards to all categories of UN police personnel, both at the headquarters and in the field, the UN police have not only met the 2020 targets that we have set out for the uniform gender parity strategy of the Department of Peace Operations, but in 3 of the 4 categories, we have already reached our targets for 2025. So thank you to all the member states. We own this achievement in no small part, as I said, to our member states, including their effort for our women senior police officer command development courses, 4 of which have resulted in active cadre of 170 senior women police officers from the rank of Lieutenant Colonel to Major General. With this talent pipeline in place, and I finalize soon, we have a ready pool of women officers able to be deployed to senior leadership positions, both in the headquarters and in the field. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, this year we celebrate 60 years of the United Nations policing. Ghana and Nigeria provided police officers for the first UN police deployment in Congo in 1960 and have continued to support us throughout our long history. As I said, our main police contributing countries are from Africa. Going forward, I hope that we can count on even greater support from our member states in Africa, of course, from the regional organizations, African Union, regional economic communities, and all. Together, we can make a meaningful and lasting impact on the lives of the people we serve, and we hope that we can bring hope, trust, with credibility to the communities that we serve. Looking forward for the discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carrillo. Without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to Her Excellency Anita Ngebo, Deputy Joint Special Representative of the African Union United Nations Mission in Darfur. Thank you. Hello, Your Excellency, can you hear us? Okay, perhaps we shall move on then to the next speaker until Her Excellency is able to join us. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over then to Dr. Solange Bandiaki-Badji. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Greetings to everyone and all protocol observed. In my 5-minute presentation, I would like to focus on 3 points that relate to the implementation of the UN Resolution 1325 that pertain to the Africa continent, and also I'll draw some ways forward and also bringing in some examples from the work we're doing at Partners Global in the region. First, I would like to talk about, following on the previous panelist, talking about how to foster collaboration between women and law enforcement. As we could see, the mainstream WPS agenda focuses on women's participation and representation within the security sector. Also, their participation in the UN and the Africa Union peacekeeping mission, which is really great. But if we look at the Africa continent right now, for example, what is happening in Nigeria with all the protests related to police brutality, and also when there are elections in many African countries, all the electoral violence and also the impact on women. then that make me believe that it is important to move beyond the numbers and beyond the security institutions and see how to build trust between female law enforcement and women who are generally victims of sexual and gender-based violence. So I think the numbers, having more women within the security sector is great, but let's move beyond the numbers. Across Africa, mainly, for example, in the Sahel region, women face particular risk and threat to their security, such as domestic and sexual violence. We've also seen levels of extremism and conflict in the region, which also make women indirect victims of insecurity, as male family members are either killed, abducted, or disappeared, and then leaving women to head their household alone. So despite these special protection concerns, women often feel less inclined to approach law enforcement for assistance. Then the question is, how do we make sure that we can, for example, use the police to really work with women as citizens, in addition to, of course, working on improving or having more women within the security sector? For example, if you take many countries or many police stations across Africa, they have what they call the gender desk. For example, in Guinea, where we do work, they have what they call the Office of the Protection of Gender, Children and Morals, or PROGEN. So what they do really have like sensitization program around how to prevent gender-based violence, but also they go into the communities and engage with women's association on how to deal with gender violence at the local level, at the community level. You take countries like Burkina Faso, they do have the Association of Female Officials of the National Police. They also do host awareness raising activities and facilitate training sessions and community dialogues to eliminate gender discrimination and related law enforcement policies. In Senegal, for example, they have the Association of Female Pioneers of the National Police, those who are retired, and they decided to create an association. They have the gender desk within the police, the gendarmerie, and most recently within the army. So I think if we look at many African countries who have those gender desks within the police, it is important to see how do we use female police officers to engage with women within the communities at the national level to deal with specific issues. So that's one point. The second point, it's a gap, but also it's an opportunity, which is how do we tap into African women's collective agency and their role in formal peace processes. It is true that as conflict and crisis in Africa took a more complex turn in recent years, there has been a devastating upsurge of violence against women and girls. I think, however, it is important to move away from always portraying African women as victims. And somebody talked about how do we change the narrative to recognizing African women's leadership role in conflict resolutions and prioritize African women's coalition building and the power of collective action and voice. So I think African women, they thrive when they work as a coalition, when they have associations, but generally they are seen as individual. So this individualistic approach generally doesn't let us really tap into those existing ones at the local level. And there are also many African women's peace and security networks at the regional level, at the national level, at the local level, and local women's mediators who have traditionally played a key role in community social cohesion. Moving forward, I think it is important to support local African women peace builders or these local women's mediators and in coaching on mediation approaches to proactively address and reduce violent conflict and engage in conflict resolution. For example, if I take the case of the Casamance region in Senegal, which is the south west of Senegal and bordering the Gambia and Guinea-Bissau. Casamance is the oldest conflict in Africa since 1982, and the conflict is still going on. It's a no peace, no war. But what women have decided there, the women at the local level, they've created an association. But at some point they realized that alone, even within that coalition, that local coalition, they cannot really claim their spaces within the peace process. They decided to really reach out to women within Senegal and create this solidarity and broader coalition. They also created a forum that embraced women from the Gambia and from Guinea-Bissau. So that shows how the power of collective action that African women are really they tend to have, how we can tap into that for peace and security in Africa. And the last and third point that I wanted to really talk about is the link between gender and natural resource conflict. And here I would like to focus on the farmer-herder conflict that we're seeing across Africa, but mainly in the Sahel. Farmer-herder conflicts are driven by an intersection of issues related to environmental degradation, demographic factors, changes in livelihood, and weak governance. These conflicts, as we all have seen, are intensifying as they interact with complex political and security dynamics, but also including violent extremist movements. Unfortunately, initiatives that tackle farmer-herder conflicts are often developed in silos with different stakeholders working on segments of the issue in isolation of each other or without taking into account the gender dynamics and the specific impact on pastoralist women and women farmers. And we know that in many agricultural and pastoral livelihood systems in Africa, women's right to natural resources are typically strongest in common, from which they draw water and gather food, medicine, and wood for cooking fuel. And my last point is that it is imperative that stabilization efforts take these intersecting issues into account. Otherwise, they might aggravate and amplify conflict and gender inequalities rather than creating paths to conflict resolution. So these are the 3 points that I wanted to share, and I'm sure during the conversation, we can talk more about some other issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor. If we may, and if Her Excellency is available, we'll now try and see if Her Excellency is there. So Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
I'm here, the joys of trying to join you from Zalinji in Darfur, but I've made it. Good morning, afternoon, and evening, depending on what part of the world you are joining from. As you said, my name is Kiki Baho. I'm the Deputy Joint Special Representative of UNAMID, the peacekeeping operation in Darfur. Very pleased to be part of this panel, not just because of 20 years of women, peace, and security, but we're on our last mile challenge as UNAMID. We're getting ready to exit, we're transitioning, and the invitation is an opportunity to make me stop and reflect, to share experience, and to share approaches moving forward, and hopefully in the discussion, get some ideas. Maybe where to start the story. UNAMID deployed in a very extreme situation. It's estimated that 300,000 people had been killed at that time, and hundreds of thousands of people had been displaced. The communities, the civilian communities were severely affected. We saw abductions, we saw violence that included rape, sexual violence, and all of this accompanied by the stigma and the discrimination that comes from these violent acts. In addition, we have a weak rule of law system here, weak accountability mechanisms, and it is under these extreme conditions that UNAMID was deployed in 2007. And UNIMID was deployed under Security Council Resolution 1769, and this was a clear protection of civilians mandate. And this protection of civilians mandate referenced 1325 and referenced the whole women's peace and security agenda. And every single resolution since the start of UNIMID has had reference to the gender agenda. And I mention that because it's important. Without the mandate, there's nothing that we would be able to do on the ground. The mandate is the starting point for action. And having this protection of civilian mandate that was specific about working on this gender agenda allowed us to deploy significant resources in our three pillars, our military pillar, our police pillar, and our civilian pillar. So I'm in peacekeeping currently, but before, my background is primarily humanitarian and development. And I have to say, hands down, in peacekeeping is where you have the largest amount of resources deployed in a country. So having these mandates that are very specific about including a certain segment of the civilian population is key. And this allowed us to collect data, information, allowed us to create awareness, allowed us to engage, allowed us to provide the necessary analysis. And this to me is important because it also gave a space for dialogue, a space for dialogue with a segment of the community that was not usually heard from. And it allowed us to hear about gendered perspectives, so women's voices could start to be heard. And maybe to talk a little bit about the three P's, to talk about participation, protection, and prevention, and our role as UNIMID in supporting that. There's a lot I could say, but just want to pick one or two examples, starting with the participation. And for Darfur, there have been three major peace agreements. The first one was in Abuja, that was before UNIMID, so I'm not going to talk about that, but there was the agreement. But the last two, the Doha agreement, UNIMID worked with civil society groups, brought together 4,000 members of civil society, 30% of whom were women, and facilitated their dialogue and interaction. And at the end of the day, the result was that the provisions that they came up with on gender equality, those provisions were part of the outcome document, which was the Doha document for peace in Darfur. The most recent agreement that was signed last month in Juba, again, we believe because of what had taken place in Abuja, what had taken place in Doha, what has happened over a decade here in Darfur, the women were empowered. So they actually came to see me in the office, and they were clear that Juba was happening. They wanted to be a part of the Juba process, but when needed support in terms of coming together and coming up with a common agenda that they could then take to Juba. And I'm pleased to say that they came up with what they called the Darfur Women's Platform. And this Darfur Women's Platform came up with a common agenda, and that common agenda, we flew 21 women to Juba to participate in the process, and they were able to influence the agreement. What I also thought was interesting is that a number of the rebel groups also had women as part of their negotiators, which was something that was fairly new when it comes to peace agreements in Darfur. So this is a word or two about participation. When it comes to protection, we undertake physical protection, we undertake work to expand the protective environment, but I would like to talk about the physical protection. At its peak, Darfur had over 25, close to 26,000 uniformed personnel in Darfur to physically protect civilians. And when you think about the number alone, it's mind-boggling. Protecting communities in their villages, protecting communities in gathering sites, protecting communities in IDPs. This was the primary role of UNAMID on the ground. I mentioned before that we are transitioning, and that means currently we're about a quarter of the initial or the peak deployment of UNAMID on the ground. And I was looking at statistics last year alone. In this reduced capacity, the military conducted 38,000 patrols. Now, what do these patrols mean, and mean particularly to women? They are what allow them to go about their livelihoods. It's what protects the route so that they can go fetch water. They can go to their farms. They can pick up firewood for their daily existence. And this is important. I remember when I first deployed, the JSR told me that his first engagement with women, he asked, but why are you going out in such a volatile argument? And the response he got shook him until today. They said, at least when we go out, the worst thing that will happen to us is that we get raped. When we send our men out there, they will not return. They will be killed. So I did want to say something about what we have done to protect by physical presence. We're about to leave, and I think this is where all the surveys, the assessments, the utility of such a peacekeeping mission will be undertaken. But I do know from our interactions with the women, from our reports, our review groups, they find this service invaluable. And in fact, they were one of the first groups to protest when the issue of UNAMID's drawdown and exit first came to the table. So I did want to say something about physical protection. And maybe because I see Louise on the roll, call, just to mention that when UNAMID deployed, there were less than 40 police women in Darfur. Now we have over 650 police women, and every day, and I want to believe that we have contributed to this as a peacekeeping operation. Currently, we have over 650 women in the police force. We've heard other speakers talk more eloquently about what this means to communities. And last but not least, I wanted to say a word or two about prevention and our contribution there. We've helped establish many networks in Darfur. My personal favorite is the Women Protection Networks. This is a network of community women. We have them in 54 localities across Darfur. These are actually our first responders when it comes to sexual and gender-based violence. These are the women who let us know. These are the women who accompany the women and children to the police station or to the local community. These are the women who provide us information for our patrols. They tell us where we need to be, they tell us why. And these are the women who serve as our early warning network on the ground. A very good example is recently we had violence close to one of our team sites called Fatabono. The first people to let us know were the women from the Women Protection Network. We got a WhatsApp text from them saying with pictures, this is what's going on right now. We immediately from mission headquarters called our team site, found out what was going on, were able to deploy again to protect. So the glass is half full. I'm talking about, I'm a half full, you know, kind of positive, seeing the good side of what's going on kind of person. So I wanted to talk about some of the positive outcomes, but I say all of this and it has not been easy. For example, one of the groups that we've supported is the Coalition of Darfur Women Legislative Caucus. Now, they have worked on discriminatory legislation in Sudan. And one infamous article, we all know it, Article 149, that conflated rape and adultery. They managed to get that overturned. And so now there is a separation between rape and adultery. But that one piece of work took 10 years, and there's several others. And it causes one to reflect. And I'm at a certain age now where you realize that often there are no quick fixes. It takes time. It's not something that's going to happen overnight, but you have to be able to go back and reflect on the changes and take courage from the positive and learn your lessons so that you're able to influence the future. I do want to make one last point. It's very hard to miss the opportunity because we are transitioning. And the transition in Darfur is arguably going to be the most difficult transition that the United Nations has ever been a part of. And why is that? It's because we're transitioning without a comprehensive peace agreement. We have a peace agreement, but one of the key actors in Darfur is not at the table, along with some smaller splinter groups. We're transitioning where we still have pockets of armed conflict. And I listened to Dr. Solange, and I don't know if you saw me nodding. We're seeing an increase in intercommunal conflict. And this is precisely the farmer-herder conflict being instrumentalized just at the time that we're getting ready to leave. We're exiting with 1.8 million IDPs still in camps and without a clear exit strategy moving forward. We're transitioning in Darfur whilst a larger transition is happening in Sudan. I know you've all been following the media, so you know what's going on with the coalition government and the current economic crisis that's taking place. And I do think that those challenges are there, but there are opportunities, and there are opportunities within the peace agreement that has been signed. There are opportunities given the fact that this is not the Bashir government. This is a coalition government.
Your Excellency, I apologize for the brief intervention, but just we need to start wrapping up. So if you could just please.
To wrap it up, just one more minute. So just saying that we are, we have opportunities in the peace agreement, in the civilian government. We have opportunities in the fact that there is a vibrant international community that has its eyes on Darfur. But I want to also end by saying that Darfur could be a big risk because it is an area where there are pockets of conflict. And I did mention the challenges that are ahead of us. And I think that what we need to do, and this is my last message, is how do we come together as an international community and support Sudan at this critical time? Because the quest for peace in Darfur is about reducing tensions, is about ensuring stability for both the women and the men and the children in Darfur. This is a critical time, and a successful and sustainable transition in Darfur will ensure a successful and sustainable transition for Sudan. And let's not forget the neighborhood in which Sudan is operating and the continent in which it's situated. Thank you very much for the time.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, and I apologize for the interruption. We are a little bit restricted in the time available to us. I'll now finally go to Dr. Yolanda Bucha. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, distinguished and esteemed guests and co-panelists. I learned a lot from this last presentation, and I think we'll have to keep an eye on what's going on and how this transition unfolds, because it's going to be an opportunity for lessons learned for those of us who are working not only in peace and security writ large, but also in seeing the role that women will have contributed to the possible stabilization of the situation in the region. And in retrospect, seeing what can be the lessons learned for other very complex operations in the region. So thank you very much for this insight. And I want to thank my co-panelists for their previous interventions as well. So I'm going to quickly try to make 3 points based on my engagement on the role of women in sustainable peace in various regions and communities in Sub-Saharan Africa. I want to make 3 points. One has to do with the role of women in the security sector. The second point, I'll talk about women in politics and how it's linked to security more broadly. And lastly, I'd like to address some of the recent protests that we've seen across various countries in Africa and how this is linked to, there's a relationship between regional and international security on the continent and domestic peace and security. So the first point I'd like to make is that, well, part of the resolution 1325 and all the other documents that followed looked at the importance of the roles, responsibilities, constraints, vulnerabilities, and opportunities that women had in terms of securing their own communities at the national level, but also at the international level. While we have seen an increase in women's participation in missions and in their communities, it's been mentioned by my previous co-panelists, we have not, in my opinion, taken stock of the experiences of women in national police forces and national defense forces. There's been a handful of research initiatives such as DCAF, which about 10 years ago took stock of the numbers of women in the police and the army and the judiciary across West Africa. But in order to improve, so we were discussing this a little bit in the previous panel, and I'm glad that someone brought it up. We've discussed the need to improve recruitment, to be sensitive to the ways in which we can invite women to participate in such institutions. But in order to improve the recruitment, in order to change the institutional cultures and the institutional obstacles that make it difficult for some women to join such hypermasculine structures, we need to hear about the experiences that women live, not only in their national forces, but once they are deployed. So I'm coming from a research perspective, and this is one of the largest gaps that I found in the literature. How has promotion and promotion policies and practices been implemented in various countries? What are the deployment requirements and what are the deployment structures that enable women to deploy once they join their forces to UN peace mission? The numbers are currently low in many national forces, which means it adds an added pressure for women who are in these forces once they have to be part of missions when their countries want to ensure gender balance in their deployment roster. And this is what we often call deployment fatigue, because you have a very small pool at the national level. African countries who want to abide by their obligation to have gender balanced deployment, but being obligated to often turn to the same women to have deployment secure. So whether we come from the standpoint of promoting the inclusion of women from an instrumental perspective, which is to say that women have, according to some philosophy, better sense of what are women's needs in communities, that they are more suited for some of the types of missions and responsibility on the ground, or whether we come from the perspective of utility or of equity, which means that we believe that women in their own right should have the opportunity, the equal opportunity to join these forces and participate. We need a level of transparency with regards to the conditions under which women work and operate in these security institutions. Now, this is a little bit tricky because we know that it is very difficult for researchers or international organizations to have access freely to women in their national armies or in their national police forces because of various security imperatives and perceptions of what could happen if they opened up the Pandora's box, if we can say, to the internal dynamic of the security institution. Some governments are sometimes resistant to allowing a full investigation, or at least getting some interviews from women who have been in the forces for a long time. But in order to successfully implement the Women, Peace and Security agenda nationally and internationally, we need to take stock of the experience of these women in the forces in which they operate. So this is a big question mark. How do we do this? How after Darfur do we take stock, for instance, of the experiences, the obstacle, the lessons learned, the opportunities that these women with a great deal of experience after years of deployment can then give to other women who will be deployed and to women in their own national armies in order to make their work more successful in the future. Now then comes the question of women in politics. Africa takes the lead in the world with regards to descriptive representation. Many lead this particular aspect of women's participation through quotas. And I know that there was a question that was asked in the previous panel about, okay, so how do we move beyond quotas? How do we move beyond individual women who can say, I am the first minister of this portfolio. I am the first woman of my country to be deployed in a UN mission in this particular capacity. How do we build a pipeline of women in politics and in decision-making powers beyond the use of quota? Now, many women in various contexts are under conditions that don't make their use of their full agency particularly easy to deploy. And this is partly due to the context of the political context in various countries, but it also is attributed to the construct. And I like the fact that we referenced this in the first panel, the construct about what are the gendered expectations about women who get involved in the security sector, but also in politics. We often expect women to do more. We often expect women to be more efficient. We also expect women to be more qualified than their male counterparts. And this is where we have an opportunity for gendered analysis. And when I mention gender analysis, I'm not simply talking about what are women doing, what are women qualified to do, but the differences in roles, expectation, and opportunities between men and women based on the gendered narrative we create about what women can and cannot do. So oftentimes what we'll see is women entering the political sphere, but expecting them to only worry about what is considered women's issue. At the same time, the expectation in order for them to be elected is that they can compete, that they can speak with a level of fluidity with all issues in order to be considered equal to men. So there's a certain level of cognitive dissonance between expecting women to only deal with women's issues, but also expecting them to be equally qualified and well-versed in topics where sometimes we prevent them from entering. So I think I'm going to go back to something that Dr. Tony mentioned about we need to interrogate the space that we actually offer women in order to allow them to push the transformation necessary to go beyond the jury commitments and frameworks. Africa has many African countries, regional organizations, including ECOWAS and the East African Community and the African Union have some of the most comprehensive frameworks for the implementation of the Women's Peace and Security agenda. But beyond having the rules and the laws and the text, how do we hold our countries, our legislators accountable once these texts are in the books? What I'm hoping is that the African Union's recently developed continental results framework for reporting, monitoring on the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda in Africa will not only be publicized so that people actually know about this new framework, but will be used not only to see whether some laws are in the books, whether national action plans have been developed, but the extent to which at every level of government, there's a level of accountability, that we have tangible indicators of increased equality at the national level, which I hope then can translate into the international level. Lastly, COVID-19 has exacerbated a lot of inequalities. And there's been a lot of focus on COVID-19 and the ways in which it has disproportionately impacted women and young people. But what global health crises usually do is not create inequalities, but lay bare the underbelly of existing inequalities. Yeah. So what a pandemic like COVID-19 has done is show us really, despite the progress that we've made in terms of allowing women to fully fulfill their potential in different sites of leadership and in different economic empowerment, it has also demonstrated the fragility because of lack of accountability, because of lack of transformation. And what that—
I want to interrupt again, just a short 1 minute warning, if that's possible.
1 minute, I'm actually quite done, almost. And what these inequalities have created is increased resistance in our population. So whether we're looking at the protests in Nigeria at the moment or the protests in Namibia, we have to be very careful and pay a specific attention to the ways in which our states respond to discontent. There is a bit of a contradiction when police respond violently to discontent while being deployed abroad for the improvement of security of women and children in countries kilometers or thousands of kilometers away. There's a level of dissonance. So to conclude, I think ultimately we need to move beyond what's on the text. We need to move beyond the numbers. We need to move beyond the laws on the books and monitor a certain level of accountability nationally, regionally, and at the African level, at the African Union level, to ensure that what's on paper is actually implemented.
Thank you very much, Doctor, and thank you to all the participants for your invaluable contributions. We have just about 15 minutes for discussion, and perhaps to open this section, if I could pose a question both to Mr. Carrillo and Your Excellency Mbeho, regarding the impact as we move beyond understanding Resolution 1325 as a normative framework and towards concrete impacts on the ground. Mr. Carrillo, if you could perhaps first speak to the UN police and its increased focus on recruiting female officers and the impacts that you may have seen from this. And then, Your Excellency, if possible, whether you could again outline some of the impacts you've seen from women's involvement in government resolution. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, and congratulations to all the panelists. I learned a lot today and very good insights. Clearly, first, police officers are agents of change, and police officers work mainly with the communities, but also they influence the status of the apparatus of the state. So when the United Nations Police is deployed, and the United Nations Police doesn't exist per se, it exists because the member states deploy under the umbrella of the United Nations. And on that focus, of course, disregarding where they are coming from, women police officers play a key role. So the first is the police contributing countries, and that's why it's important for us to exhort all the member states to increase the numbers, not in terms of the numbers per se, but because of the impact that we do on the ground. Then, second level, the United Nations Police plays a key role, or like the police as a whole, in terms of operations, law and order, criminal investigation, community policing, and within the community policing, the protection, of course, of the ones that are most in need, the victims, the elderly, the children, women, internal displaced people, refugees, and also on that level, and in some missions, it's key. We also work more closely with the host state police, but also with host state authorities in key areas. First, recruitment. There is an ongoing recruitment in Central African Republic to the police and gendarmerie, where it's really impressive how the numbers of the recruitment was done in terms of women police officers. But once again, not only because of the women per se, but because of the impact that they do in the security. And I was very, of course, the civil society, the police, we work not only with the state authorities, institutions, but with institutions from the civil society, from the community, sometimes in the IDPs, in the neighborhoods, but also, and it's interesting to see how the women are agents of change, either individually or organized in terms of communities. But also, we need to understand the specificities that sometimes the communities they have. I was very impressed, of course, and as we have a strong police component in Darfur, but in other countries, sometimes the only way for the women to give birth in good conditions is to be transported in armed police vehicles or United Nations armed police vehicles to the hospital. So the police plays a key role, and sometimes maybe the rules do not allow, but to go the extra mile to make the difference, I honestly believe that, of course, the United Nations, through all the agencies, funds and programs, the framework, but I fully agree when Yolanda was speaking, we need to go beyond the numbers. We need to go the extra mile after the frameworks that exist, because clearly, and speaking in terms of security, the world security in one country is not the security of that country, is the security of all the world. And clearly, this pandemic shows that the balance between security and freedom is key. And of course, being a police officer, and I believe that we all agree, police plays a key role. And more than that, women police officers play a key role. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. If you have a few minutes to speak to the same levels of impact you've seen in women's involvement in conflict resolution environments.
You know, my team will tell you I don't like talking about impact, because I feel that that will come after we leave and there's a proper measurement. But in terms of results, in terms of change on the ground, you know, in my presentation, I was trying to give some examples of that change. And I think the first one I tried to talk about is the women actually coming and saying, we want to be part of the recent Juba peace agreement, and how can you support us? Now, this is something that may not have necessarily happened at the start of the deployment of the operation. So over time, something has shifted. It's not perfect, but this awareness of their rights. I remember when one of our USGs came and we went to one of the IDP camps, and those IDP women started to lecture one of the USGs about Security Council 1325. And I was joking afterwards with some of our team members, I'm sure they have a better understanding of that resolution than you do. So there's something that I think there's a lot of, and that will be an interesting area to investigate after we leave. What unintended consequences have occurred because you've had this operation here for such a long time. I didn't mention, but the whole action plan, or Sudan's National Action Plan for 1325, happened because one of the networks we've put in place here in Darfur are the 1325 committees. And the 1325 committees, we supported them to come up with a regional action plan, which then formed the basis for the National Action Plan in Khartoum. There's also the expertise that we've created with this change of government. We were recently in discussions with some of the new ministers, and we sent some of our national officers there, and they were quite impressed with the level of knowledge, the level of the level of experience they had, and some of the women's groups had in Darfur, and their ability to speak. And again, you know, it just goes to show that the change was slow, but it is definite, it is visible, and I don't think you're going to be able to put the genie back in the box. Once they've let them out. As the women on this panel know, once they've let us loose, you can't put us back in the box. And I think that in no short measure, UNAMID has contributed to that. I think ultimately the test will be if we manage a sustainable peace and if this civilian government holds, because the bigger picture, and you know, I can't talk to everything, but you know, the protests in the streets of Sudan were led by women, you know, and something has switched and something is never going to be the same in Sudan. And I want to believe that somehow these international presences in a country contribute to the strengthening, the empowerment of women. And I did mention before the change in legislation. We've seen significant, you know, the criminalization of FGM, the separation of rape and adultery. Before, you needed 4 witnesses if you were raped to prove that you were raped. All of this has happened because of the backing to local groups. They have been able to influence what has happened at the national level. So maybe I leave it at that, Mark, and hand over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Your Excellency, and for your positivity as much as the substantive content. If I may pose a question now to both Dr. Bandari as well as Dr. Bucha, in relation to the intersectionality that has already been mentioned, and specifically as relates to poverty, and both its role in creating opportunities for conflict and its promotion, as well as exacerbating gender inequality. So the question specifically would be, how can we mainstream these considerations of poverty into conflict avoidance and conflict resolution practices and ideas? So perhaps if we can go first to Dr. Bandari and then Dr. Bucha on the role of poverty and mainstreaming that into conflict resolution approaches in the context of gender.
Thank you very much, Mark. And I've been enjoying the conversation. I've learned a lot from Louise and Her Excellency Anita and from Yolanda. So great contribution. I would just say maybe moving forward, because I think we have been talking a lot about the UN resolutions and like doing a critical analysis, which is great. But I think it's time to move forward, and that moving forward requires to see where are the gaps and how can we really deal with that. And I think what we're seeing right now, there are new types of conflict that goes beyond armed conflict. For example, you go into many communities, you have a land dispute, conflict around resources. Women, they need, for example, to have access and control to land in order to really, like, you know, for example, have income generations, make good use of the land, or have access to forest resources, such as non-timber forest product, so they can go and sell it to the market. But if they can't have access to land, if the communities are struggling because the private investment, like this land grabbing is happening all over Africa, and what we are seeing right now, it's this conflict between communities and corporate investors. How do we tackle those type of conflict? I think that's one. That could help really work around, like, you know, local communities and mainly women having access and not seeing their land being taken over. So the like natural resource governance is really key moving forward to really take into account. In Africa also, like I said at the beginning, we have new type of conflict related to violent extremism. It is important now to see what are the impacts, but also what role can civil society organization play to work together with government officials, to work together with the police, to work together with the United Nations, with the African Union. So I think the cross-sectoral collaboration are really needed where we are right now. And what we could see is that, for example, like, you know, the Ministry of Women's Affairs, for example, they should not be working on women's issues in silos. They should be working with the security sector. They should be working with the justice sector, because to be access to justice for women is linked to access to security. I think those are the kind of like correlation, the kind of collaboration that we need to see moving forward, and not stop working in silos, but also, like I said, keep in mind that resources are key to African communities. Access to resources are key to women. And in order for them really to be, like for sustainable peace in Africa, we need to really look into within our communities. And like I said, also work together with security forces, because what is happening in Nigeria, it's not common to Nigeria. I mean, it's spreading all over the world. But how do we prevent that from happening again? Electoral violence is all over, and many women who are really seeking like office are facing violence when they engage into politics. How do we deal with that? So I think that we have a panoply of opportunities that we can tap into.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bucha. If we could have your contribution in a few minutes, thank you.
I think it's a very broad question in the sense that you can take it from the perspective of context where conflict is already ongoing and exacerbating inequalities and poverty and vulnerabilities on women. But I think on my end, I think I would like to look at it from a preventative measure. And this, it touches on the point that I've mentioned at the end of my remarks with regard to the increased discontent of populations with regards to their government's responsiveness to different social and economic issues. If you consider a gendered analysis of insecurity right at the tipping point between unrest and full-blown conflict, you'll see that there are gender dynamics with regards to poverty, access to resources and employment, and the reason why armed groups are able to recruit young men, right? So if you look at this gendered analysis, not only in terms of what is the impact of poverty on women, but the ways in which expectations of young men needing to provide for their families are shattered by the social economic conditions in their countries. How do organizations that don't necessarily abduct their participants, but recruit their participants through promises of financial remuneration in their participation, are all linked to this link between poverty and insecurity. And I think what is very dangerous is when we fail to take opportunities to listen to populations and to listen to communities before there becomes an opportunity to mobilize people for conflict. So I'm looking at these instances of unrest. You know, in Africa, what we've seen is a decrease in civil war, but increase in popular unrest. People are taking the streets, and if they're not listened to, it becomes an opportunity for mobilization for internal conflict. So for me, the gender analysis doesn't only look at women's access to resources, but looking in terms of the configuration of gender expectations and what people think they are owed as citizens, as full citizens of countries, and the failures of their governments to respond to those socioeconomic challenges that then push many young men into engaging in armed conflict.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bucha, and all of our distinguished panelists for your contributions. I know I speak for everybody when I say that we could sit here and listen to all of you discuss these issues for hours, but unfortunately we are just about out of time. As a closing remark from myself, I'd like to reiterate that in your different sectors, we are grateful for your ongoing efforts and for the steps that you have already achieved. But if I may borrow a phrase from Your Excellency, that we are also excited for the positive unintended consequences which arise as a result of all of your good work. So thank you very much, and I'd like to hand over back to my colleague Andrew to wrap up the event. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you to all of our distinguished guests, and particularly to the last panel who summarized but also brought new depth of discussion to many of the issues that were raised as well. I'd just like to thank all distinguished guests from the first panel, but also from the second panel, academics and policymakers who participated and took time out to be with us today. We've had two dynamic panels who have addressed many of the issues highlighted at the start of the webinar. And my hope is that we can continue to convert many of these discussion points talked about today into substantial policy change, and not just have a discussion, but move the rights of women in peace and security forward. So for more information on upcoming events, please visit our website. But for now, thank you again for all of you who joined, and hopefully see you soon. Take care.